The scripture this morning is from the Gospel of John, chapter 21, verses 1 through 15. Listen for God's word to you. This was after Easter, by the way. Jesus showed himself again to the disciples by the Sea of Tiberias. And he showed himself in this way. Gathered there together were Simon Peter, Thomas called the twin, Nathanael of Cana in Galilee, the sons of Zebedee, and two other disciples. And Simon Peter said, "I'm going fishing." And they said to him, "Well, we'll go with you." And they went out and they got into the boat, but that night they caught nothing. Just after daybreak, Jesus stood on the beach. But the disciples did not know it was Jesus. And Jesus said to them, "You have no fish, have you?" You can imagine how thrilled they might have been to have a stranger. They said no. And he said to them, "Cast the net to the right side of the boat and you'll find some." So they cast it. And now they were not able to haul it in because there were so many fish. And the disciple whom Jesus loved, that's how John referred to himself. The disciple whom Jesus loved said to Peter, "It's the Lord." And when Peter heard that it was Jesus, he put on his outer garment, for he had taken it off, and he jumped into the sea. But the other disciples came in the boat, dragging the net full of fish, for they were not far off the land, about 100 yards off. When they got ashore, they saw a charcoal fire there, with fish already on it, and some bread. And Jesus said to them, "Bring some of the fish that you've just caught." So Simon Peter went aboard and hauled the net ashore, full of large fish, 153 of them. And though there were so many, the net was not torn. And Jesus said to them, "Come and have some breakfast." Now none of the disciples at this point dared ask him, "Who are you?" because they knew it was Jesus. Jesus came and took the bread and gave it to them and did the same with the fish. And this was now the third time that Jesus appeared to the disciples after he was raised from the dead. And when they'd finished breakfast, Jesus said to Simon Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" And Simon said to Jesus, "Lord, you know that I love you." And then Jesus said, "Feed my lambs." And then a second time Jesus said to him, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" And Peter said to him, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." And Jesus said to him, "Tend my sheep." And then Jesus said to him a third time, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" And he said, "Lord, you know everything. You know that I love you." And Jesus said to him, "Feed my sheep." And Peter felt hurt because Jesus asked him the third time, "Do you love me?" And Jesus then said, "Very truly I tell you, when you were younger, you used to fasten your own belt and go wherever you wished. But when you grow older, you will stretch out your hands, and someone else will fasten a belt around you and take you where you did not wish to go." And Jesus said this to indicate the kind of death by which he would glorify God. And after this, Jesus said to Peter, "Follow me." Just checking to see how we're doing on time. Let's see if I had time for the joke. So Bill Gates died and went to heaven and found that he had a very nice suit. In fact, 2 tailor-made suits were his. He had an extremely nice house in heaven. And he felt, I'm pretty well off here too. This is all right. And he walked around, and all of a sudden he saw this other man who had way more possessions. He had a yacht. He had all kinds of fancy stuff, 2 mansions. And so Bill said, he went over to St. Peter and said, why does this guy have so much more than I do? And so Peter said, well, that's the captain of the Titanic. He only crashed once. The inventor of Windows. Has nothing to do with the sermon, but it was time for a groaner. So today's message is going to focus on some things that we learned through this encounter with Peter. But before we look at Peter, I want to say just a few things about the fact that Jesus had disciples at all. As most of you know, one of the first things Jesus did when he stepped fully into his public ministry at about age 30 for 3 years that culminated in him dying on the cross, one of the first things he did was gather a bunch of disciples. They were people who would walk with him closely. And there were 12 men, all know the 12 guys, and there were also many women who were disciples. That's very, very clear. But the fact that there were disciples at all show us a few things. First, following Jesus is a path. And I've made this point many times since I've been here. It's a path. It's not just a matter of believing in God or believing that there's a higher power or there's something out there watching over us. I mean, that's a great place to start. It's beautiful. But following Jesus, which is how I would define what it means to be a Christian, is a matter of being on a specific path in which we learn to know and experience God in the same way that Jesus did. And that path requires commitment. It requires the practice of some spiritual disciplines like prayer and meditation. And I know some of you hate the word discipline, and it makes you think of it's going to be some austere, self-denial, austerity thing. Discipline doesn't have to be joyless. It's just the specific things you do to increase the chances that something vital and alive might happen within you and between you and God. A friend of mine had a sign on her kitchen wall that I loved. It said, "You either experience the pain of discipline or the pain of regret. Make your choices wisely." The second thing that we see about discipleship is that the path of Jesus is about community. He called a bunch of people to do this together. And I'm not going to say much more about that, but it's really important. Unless you're called to be a hermit, and there are a few people who are called to be, experience that kind of long-term solitude as their spiritual practice, but not many of us. So unless you're called to be a hermit, then none of us are meant to try to do spirituality on our own. We need each other. I would say, while I'm the first one, as you know, to say it's fine if you miss church. There are other things that happen on Sunday mornings. I get it. But we really do need, for our own spiritual well-being, to be doing this together. And I love it when a lot of you show up on a Sunday morning, because there's more energy and we get to build our relationships and get to know each other. But the point is, this is not about each of us as individuals having a private spiritual experience. You don't need a community to do that. But to be a follower of Jesus is a call into doing it with other people. The last thing I'll say is that the disciples were a very diverse bunch of folks, of completely ordinary people. So there is no one kind of person who's more wired for this than others. And the disciples, very diverse bunch of folks, and part of why they're there is so we can look at them and say, oh, I can relate to him. And maybe some of you will relate to Peter today, or her. Peter, now, for those of you who don't know much about the Bible, and it's totally okay if you don't, you got to start somewhere. Put a little plug in for our post-worship Bible study, which Zoom people can join also. after church in about 11:30 or so, we have Bible study, and it's a no dumb such thing as a dumb questions asked Bible study. You don't have to know anything. It presupposes nothing. You just come, and we always have beautiful conversations based on the scriptures. But Peter was a blue-collar guy. He was a working fisherman. He was outspoken. He had few, if any, filters. He was a leader, but raw and rough, and often in his own way, and often putting his foot in his mouth, or saying things that he might have intended and meant but couldn't back up. He was sort of a ready, fire, aim kind of guy. Most fishermen who made their living fishing the huge lake known as the Sea of Galilee, it's a huge lake, hated the Romans who had invaded their country and taken over the land and all of the natural resources, including the Sea of Galilee. And you know, I've pretty much come to just accept that every story in the Bible that is in the context of being around the Sea of Galilee has political and social overtones to it because of how loaded that context was. The Roman Emperor Tiberius had seized control of the Sea of Galilee, and the fishing industry that prospered there, and he had the nerve to put his own name on it, change the name of it to the Sea of Tiberius, taxed the heck out of all local fishermen's earnings, and took all the larger quality fish for export and for sale to wealthy people who could afford it. So the little detail in the story about the fish being large fish, and by the way, when there's a detail like 153 fish, you can pretty much count that that's there for a loaded reason. 153 in the code language of Hebrew alphabetical numerology. If you work that out, and I'm not going to take the time to try to tell you how it works, but if you work it out, it spells the words, I am God. I am, remember, that's the name of Yahweh. So it was their way of saying to Rome in code language, you don't own this lake. God owns it, and God owns all the fish in it. That's just a little Bible study candy for you. Peter was bold for Jesus. That's one of the things I love about him. Yep, he was rough and raw and often got it wrong, but he showed up. And Ken Wilber, a Buddhist spiritual philosopher, he said, you know, there are really 4 components to an authentic spiritual journey. Wake up, clean up, grow up, and show up. Peter showed up. Some of you remember what happened, though, on the last night of Jesus' life on earth. When they were in the upper room having that Last Supper together, Jesus told his disciples once again that he was going to be killed. And he was not subtle about it. In fact, he broke the bread and he gave it to them and said, this is my body, which is about to be broken. And this cup is my blood. It's get real time, guys. And Peter, at the table, stood up and said, Jesus, no way. Peter wanted Jesus to overthrow the Romans. And he said he would not accept that Jesus was going to get killed, that it wasn't going to be a success story. And so Peter said, no way, I will fight for you, Jesus. If I have to die tonight, I will die for you. And you know, Peter meant it. Jesus' response, a lot of you know the story, but some of you don't. His response was, Peter, before the rooster crows tomorrow morning, you're going to 3 times deny that you even know who I am. And Peter, I'm sure, thought, no way. And later that night, when they're in the Garden of Gethsemane, which, by the way, is a grove of olive trees spread out, not too unlike this, just bigger, but beautiful olive trees that are still there 2,000 years later. I've been there. Later that night, when Judas, the betrayer, brought the Roman soldiers to arrest Jesus in the middle of the night quietly, when Peter saw what was happening, he went up and he got his sword out and he drew his sword and he sliced off the ear of one of the Romans. So these were not idle words. And then Jesus says, no, Peter. And the last miracle Jesus did was to reach down on the ground and pick up the ear from this servant of a Roman soldier and somehow miraculously put it back, take his hand away, and it's there again. And then he turns to Peter and he says words that have been quoted often historically, rarely put into practice. He said, Peter, those who live by the sword die by the sword. And he was in essence saying, I have not come to start yet another war for any reason. So Jesus is taken away, and you know what happens then later that night. All the disciples gather later that night. In fact, it's in the middle of the night. In fact, right by dawn the next, probably 5 o'clock in the morning, Friday morning, Peter says, I got to go see what they're doing to Jesus. And so he gets close to the city, up by the city gate, and there's a charcoal fire. And some people are warming themselves by the fire. And so Peter goes up, took some courage to get that close to the danger zone. And some woman says, hey, I recognize you. You were with Jesus, weren't you? And he says, no, it wasn't. One time. And then a woman says, no, I recognize you. And your accent, you have the same accent as Jesus. You're from Galilee. I know you were with him. And Peter says, I don't know what you're talking about. I don't know the man. 2 times. And then one more says, no, I know you're with him. I saw you too. And Peter gets upset and he says, I don't know him. 3 times. And the rooster crows. And Peter goes off into probably the most intense shame spiral of his life to that point. Which is why a few days later on Easter morning, when Jesus appears first to Mary, and they finish their conversation, and she says, now go tell all the guys and Peter. I've pointed this out before. Why did Peter get pointed out specifically? Because Peter needed to be pointed out specifically. All right, so now we're into our text for today in this strange conversation. There are only 2 times in the Bible when the Greek word for charcoal fire is used. The first is in Peter's denial around that fire. And the only other one is in this breakfast charcoal fire on the beach with Jesus. And just as Peter denied 3 times knowing Jesus at that first fire, Jesus asks him 3 times, do you love me, Peter? And Peter says, yes. And Jesus each time says, well, then feed my lambs, and we'll end with that. But here's the gold that we can mine from this. The amazing grace of God gives us chances to revisit the very places in our lives where we blew it most painfully. And gives us new chances this time to get it right, or to do it better, or to show that we've learned from our mistakes and to make a different choice. And that's how the shame eventually just gets washed away. To be blunt, let's say someone here was unfaithful in a relationship. Grace means having opportunities either in the same relationship or in a new relationship to be around the second charcoal fire. And this time to be faithful. You know, I think one of the most romantic things, especially for those of you who come to church but your spouse doesn't, when you go home and they say, well, what was the message about? You can say, honey, you may not have been my first rodeo, but you are my second charcoal fire. Maybe you lied at some point. Hello. Welcome to my house. Maybe you lied at some point. Okay, Jesus is now with you at second charcoal fires where you get a chance to tell the truth when it's not easy to tell the truth. You get the point, right? You fill in the blanks, you connect the dots, you make the connections in your life. Grace means that opportunities where you blew it spiral back around to you. And this time with Christ there with you, you get to make a better choice. It doesn't get any better than that. So I'm going to end by saying this. First, Peter never got it all together. He was never perfect. He did a whole lot better and became one of the leaders of the early church. But, you know, newer gospels like the Gospel of Mary and the Gospel of Thomas are making it clear that Peter was the primary one who had a problem with Mary and was jealous that Jesus had stuff going on with Mary and information he entrusted to her that the others were jealous about. You know, he never got over his own patriarchy. It's not about being perfect. It's about continuing to progress, continuing to grow up. And when Peter, who abandoned and denied Jesus because he was afraid of the Romans, later on as a leader, a primary leader in the church, was arrested and beaten and killed himself for following Jesus, was about to be crucified according to tradition. And he said, no, I am not worthy to die the way Jesus did, so crucify me upside down. And they did. So he got another chance to show some courage. But I just want to end with this sheep thing. Because not only does grace give you back another crack at things that you missed the first time, but once you are solid in and with your relationship with God, then grace says, okay, now I got a job for you. I got work for you. Don't just come around me or the church or whatever to be fed. I mean, I hope you are fed. But if you really get it, come around here to share the work. Feed my lambs. So I want to ask you, how are you feeding lambs here in this community? If this is becoming your primary spiritual community, and I hope it is, or at least one of them, are you feeding any lambs around here? Or beyond here? What's your ministry? What are your new marching orders? How are you using your gift? And I'll just be blunt. We need some of you new folks to step up and to take on some of the work so that we can release some of you who've been doing it so faithfully for so long. And we don't want you to go anywhere, but we do want to require a little less of you as we move forward. And you know who you are, we know who you are, and we adore you, we love you. And we also want you to be able to say, my tour of duty here is transitioning. That won't happen unless more of us say, okay, yeah, I'm ready. And the only requirement is that you do your best and you want to be close to God. That's all. So, if this message had a title, I would call it Love at the Second Charcoal Fire. Amen.